You know the story. A curious girl, a rabbit with a witch, a fall into a dream world that feels safe enough for children and strange enough to fascinate adults. But once you step behind the curtain and see how the tale was truly born, Wonderland stops being a fantasy and becomes something far more unsettling. For more than a century, Alice in Wonderland has floated through culture as whimsical nonsense, a fairy tale of riddles and tea parties, a comforting dream. Yet the historical truth is nothing like the nursery version. Its roots stretch into the darkest corners of Victorian England, wrapped in secrets, addictions, political violence, and personal shadows its author worked hard to disguise. Behind every smiling illustration, there is a real world that was falling apart, and once you enter that world, you cannot unread it. If you enjoy uncovering the truth behind stories we thought were innocent, take a moment to subscribe. The next chapter opens the door to the mysteries Victorian England tried to erase. When Charles Dodgson died in 1898, the myth of Wonderland should have ended with him. Instead, something even stranger began. His family gathered in his Oxford rooms, surrounded by his papers, his ink bottles, his quiet little world of mathematics and fantasy. And then they did something no writer's family should ever do. They started cutting pages out of his diaries. Not one page, not two, entire sections, gone. The pages they chose were not random. They tore out the exact period when Dodgson was closest to Alice Liddell, the real child who inspired Wonderland, as if they believed that whatever he had written there could not be allowed to survive. Imagine the scene: an oak desk, a pair of scissors, a silence heavy enough to crush the room, ink handwriting exposed for only a few seconds before the family snipped it away forever. Some accounts say the missing pages were burned, the flames swallowing the name Alice just as quickly as Dodgson had written it. To destroy a man's own words is to admit they should never be read, and that act alone reshaped everything we think we know about Wonderland. The missing pages did not just erase an event. They created a question so large that it still shadows the story today. To understand the weight of those missing diary pages, you have to step into the world Charles Dodgson actually lived in. Not the playful dreamscape he invented, the real one, the one Victorian England tried very hard not to look at. Dodgson was not just a mathematician, not just a storyteller. He was a man who formed an unusual number of close friendships with very young girls. He photographed them, wrote them elaborate letters, invited them to his private imaginative world in ways that Victorian society quietly tolerated and quietly questioned. Even in his own time, whispers followed him, not accusations, not proof, but a discomfort that appears again and again in notes from his contemporaries. The same discomfort that makes the missing diary pages feel like a warning light someone tried to shut off. And then there was Alice Liddell, not a symbol, not a character, a real child, bright, curious, confident, the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, living just steps from Dodgson's college rooms. Dodgson adored her. He invented stories for her. He carried his camera across fields to photograph her. He wrote her name in diary entries with an emotional intensity that biographers still debate. Their closeness was the heart of Wonderland, but it was also the source of a hidden and unexplained fracture. In 1863, 1 year after the famous river trip, Dodgson's relationship with the Liddell family abruptly collapsed. Visits stopped, letters stopped, photographs stopped, and the diary page describing that very day was one of the pages cut out after his death. That silence is louder than anything he ever wrote, because when a friendship ends suddenly, and the only record of why is physically removed from history, it forces a question. What happened? Why did the family intervene? What was written so carefully that it needed to be cut out so thoroughly? And why, in the middle of all this quiet turmoil, was Dodgson writing a story about a girl falling deeper and deeper into a world where nothing makes sense anymore? The shadow behind Dodgson and Alice is not a single scandal. It is the emotional tension of a relationship that Victorian society never fully understood, and that history was never allowed to explain. When Dodgson first wrote Alice's Adventures, it wasn't meant for the world. It wasn't meant for bookstores, critics, or printing presses. It was a private gift, a quiet, handwritten manuscript created solely for Alice Liddell, a small world built for one child. And that original version was different, very different. It was gentler, simpler, filled with inside jokes only the Liddell children would understand. No Mad Hatter, no Duchess with a violent baby, no grotesque transformations, no nightmare imagery. Those disturbing scenes, the ones everyone knows today, were not part of the original story at all. They appeared later. Only when Dodgson decided to publish the book did the tone shift into something darker, something twisted, something deliberately unsettling. He added the Duchess's baby. He added the mad tea party. He added the bizarre logic loops, the surreal transformations, the unsettling mood that pushes through every page of Wonderland. Publishing didn't just expand the story, it changed the entire world of it. A tender, private tale became a coded message to Victorian society, and the additions were not random. Each one pointed towards something real, something uncomfortable, something Victorian England preferred to keep hidden. The transformations, the madness, the arbitrary violence, the confusion of identity, the chaotic courtroom, nothing in those expanded chapters was childish. Nothing was innocent. They were reflections of a society sick beneath its polished surface. This is the Wonderland the world remembers, not the gentle story written for Alice Liddell, but the darker, sharper, more symbolic world Dodgson built afterwards, when he knew adults would be reading. So why did he do it? And why did he choose horror, of all things, to carry the weight of his message? The answer is hidden in the world around him, a world where nightmares were normal, and dream logic made more sense than reality. To understand why Wonderland is filled with bottles, potions, and impossible transformations, you have to step into the real Victorian household. Not the polished image from paintings, the true one. The one where almost every kitchen cabinet hid a bottle of liquid opium. Victorian England was addicted, not metaphorically, literally. Laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium, was everywhere. It sat beside teacups, beside sewing baskets, beside cradle boards. Doctors prescribed it. Chemists sold it freely. Mothers used it casually, sometimes daily, without ever being told what it really was. 5 out of 6 families used it. Some used it to sleep, some to calm their nerves, some simply to endure poverty. But the most shocking use of all was the way it was given to children. Infants, toddlers, babies still learning to breathe properly. Cry too much? Laudanum. Won't sleep? Laudanum. Teething? Laudanum. And no one spoke of it as dangerous. It was normal, necessary, a quiet secret woven into daily life. The coroner's book tells a different story. Pages filled with infants found cold and still in their cribs. Doctors describing small bodies that looked shrunken, aged, hollowed by narcotics their families never understood. And while all of this was happening, while England drowned its pains in opium, Dodgson was writing a story about a little girl who drinks mysterious liquids, eats strange substances, and begins to shrink, to grow, to lose her sense of her own body. Modern readers like to joke that Wonderland is psychedelic, a fantasy of impossible transformations, but the truth is far darker. Dodgson wasn't drawing from future counterculture. He was drawing from the world right in front of him. A world where substances changed children every day, not through magic, but through poison. Wonderland's potions weren't metaphors for imagination. They were echoes of what Victorian families were already living through in silence. And in the next chapter of this tale, Dodgson made that truth impossible to ignore. If Wonderland's potions reflected the quiet poison inside Victorian homes, the Mad Hatter reflected the poison attacking Victorian workers, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. In hat factories across England, men spent their lives bent over steaming tables, turning rabbit fur into felt. The process required mercury nitrate, a chemical so toxic that one breath could linger in the body for years, carving its way into nerves, muscles, and memory. Workers breathed those vapors every day, every hour, every minute. At first, the symptoms seemed harmless: a slight tremor in the hand, a bit of nervousness, a twitch of the jaw. Then it grew, hands shaking so violently a spoon could not be lifted, speech breaking into slurs and involuntary laughs, sudden rages, hallucinations, visions of animals crawling along workshop walls, faces appearing in corners that disappeared when approached. And when the madness became impossible to hide, the factory simply replaced the worker. No compensation, no treatment, no concern. They were paid until the poison claimed them, then forgotten. Everyone knew why it happened. Doctors knew, factory owners knew, politicians knew. The entire country used a phrase for it: mad as a hatter. A joke, a punchline, a way to laugh at tragedy that ruined entire communities. This is the figure Dodgson brought into Wonderland. A man trapped in eternal tea time, forever jittering, forever talking in circles, forever glowing with a frantic madness that never finds rest. Readers see whimsy, but the real Victorians saw something else, a reflection of a workplace that slowly destroyed its own workers. Wonderland wasn't meant to be harmless. It was a mirror held up to society that could tolerate madness as long as it came from the poor. And the next character Dodgson created held an even bloodier history behind her smile. The Queen of Hearts is often remembered as a joke, a loud, theatrical monarch who screams for beheadings she never gets, a cartoon tyrant, a playful exaggeration. But Victorian readers knew exactly who she was and what she represented. Because her world of painted roses, her frantic punishments, her obsession with executions, was rooted in one of the bloodiest chapters in English history. In Wonderland, gardeners scramble to paint white roses red. On the surface, it seems absurd, but to a Victorian audience, the symbolism was unmistakable. The red rose meant Lancaster, the white rose meant York, and those two symbols belonged to families locked into wars so brutal that entire towns were soaked in blood. The War of the Roses were not distant legend, not forgotten history. They were national trauma. At the Battle of Towton, the snow ran red with the blood of 28,000 men. It is still the deadliest day in English history. At Tewkesbury, the defeated Lancastrians dragged themselves into the abbey for sanctuary and were pulled out one by one to be executed in the streets. Some for treason, some for loyalty, some simply for wearing the wrong-colored flower in their clothes. Imagine living in a world where your life depended on the plant embroidered on your jacket. That is the world Dodgson encoded in The Queen of Hearts. A monarch who kills not for justice, but for preference, for whim, for the wrong color. Victorians recognized the parallel instantly. Because they were taught these stories the way modern children learn fairy tales, they understood that the Queen's madness was not nonsense, but memory. A reminder that English power, for most of its history, was arbitrary, violent, and utterly indifferent to the people beneath it. Wonderland wasn't a child's dream. It was a map of real horrors wrapped in surreal imagery, and nowhere was that clearer than in the part of Victorian life that shaped children more than anything else. To Victorian adults, Wonderland looked like delightful chaos, but to Victorian children, it felt familiar in a way that was almost painful, because their world was already built on nonsense. Picture a classroom in the 1860s, 12 girls standing stiffly in identical pinafores, hands behind their backs, eyes straight ahead, a governess pacing with a thin wooden cane, ready to strike the first pair of knuckles that hesitates. Education was not learning, it was obedience. Children memorized poems they did not understand, chanted verses about morality they could never question, repeated multiplication tables like mechanical echoes because curiosity was treated as rebellion. They were raised to know words without meaning, rules without purpose, order without logic. Dodgson knew this world intimately. He taught at Oxford. He watched young minds buckle under the weight of memorization. He saw how rigid thinking could shatter a child's sense of self, and he placed that collapse directly inside Alice. When she tries to recite her lessons in Wonderland, nothing works. Her math fractures, her geography twists into nonsense. The more she tries to cling to memorized knowledge, the more she loses herself. "Who are you?" the caterpillar asks, and she cannot answer. Because everything she has ever been taught is slipping through her fingers like water turning into sand. Dodgson wasn't mocking childhood. He was mocking the system that crushed it. The system that taught children to obey, but never to think. The system that believed identity came from reciting the right words instead of understanding them. Wonderland exposes that lie. And the moment it does, Alice begins to change. Yet the greatest collapse of Victorian logic is still ahead, waiting for her in the place where justice is supposed to live. The deeper Alice falls into Wonderland, the more she realizes something terrifying. The madness isn't random. It is organized, structured, presented as law. And nowhere is that clearer than the trial. A courtroom where evidence means nothing, where logic is mocked, where guilt is decided before the accused even speaks, where the judge interrupts, the witnesses contradict themselves, and the Queen demands punishment before the changes are finished. To modern readers, it feels absurd. To Victorians, it felt uncomfortably real. Their courts were not temples of justice, they were battlegrounds of class. In London, a poor woman could be sentenced to 6 months of hard labor for stealing a loaf of bread to feed her starving children. That same week, an aristocrat who assaulted a housemaid might walk free after paying a fine smaller than the price of his breakfast champagne. Justice was not blind. She was selective. She saw wealth. She saw class. She saw connections. And she ruled accordingly. Dodgson lived in that world. He read those newspapers. He walked those uneven tracks where the powerful stepped over the powerless. He saw verdicts that made no moral sense, only social sense. So he recreated that world in Wonderland and stripped away the polite language that usually hides cruelty. In the trial scene, everyone knows the trial is a farce. Everyone knows the Queen is dangerous. Everyone knows the verdict has already been chosen. Alice knows it, but she has something the others do not. She has nothing left to lose. When she stands up, when she speaks the truth, when she rejects the entire illusion of authority, she sees the courtroom for what it really is: a deck of cards, paper pretending to be power. And once exposed, it collapses. Wonderland did not distort Victorian justice, it revealed it. And that revelation leads us into the final truth, the one Dodgson never wanted to write, but could not escape. When the Queen's courtroom collapses, when the cards scatter, when the illusion of authority finally tears apart, Alice wakes up. But the story doesn't end there. Not really. Because Wonderland is not about escape. It is about revelation. Every character, every transformation, every moment of madness is a mirror held up to Victorian England, a world that pretended to be orderly, moral, civilized, while quietly rotting behind closed doors. The Missing Diary pages remind us that the truth was too dangerous to leave behind. The dark editions in the published book show a man using fantasy to say what reality would not allow. The opium bottles, the poisoned infants, the trembling hatmakers, the blood-stained roses, the collapsing classrooms, the corrupt courts, all of it was real, and all of it was hidden. Dodgson wrote Wonderland as a dream, because dreams can say what waking life cannot. He buried the horrors of his world in nonsense, because nonsense is harder to censor. He wrapped his warnings in whimsy, because whimsy slips past the guards of polite society. And that is why the story endures. Children see adventure, adults see satire, historians see confusion. Wonderland is not an escape from Victorian England. It is a coded guide to understanding it. Its madness wasn't random, it was a map. Its characters weren't fantasies, they were truths wearing masks. And its greatest revelation wasn't about a little girl trying to find her way through a dream, but about a society desperate to avoid waking up. The real magic of Alice in Wonderland, the magic Dodgson never admitted out loud, is that he hid an entire world's darkness inside a child's story and somehow made it timeless. Wonderland survives because the questions it asks are still the ones we avoid. Who controls truth? Who decides justice? Who is allowed to question the world? And who is punished for trying? The book ends when Alice opens her eyes, but the truth begins the moment you realize that Wonderland wasn't nonsense at all. It was the only honest place left. If you want more stories where fantasy hides a forgotten truth, subscribe now. The next mystery is already waiting in the shadows.